With nowhere to live, he walks into a market with the last coins in his pocket. What happens next changes lives and reveals a secret that has been hidden for more than 20 years. The suffocating heat of the Chicago afternoon transformed the West Side asphalt into a merciless furnace. Michael Newman adjusted Claire in his arms, feeling the growing weight of his 2-year-old daughter, who dozed against his sweaty chest. The old pickup truck, parked 3 blocks from the supermarket, exuded a persistent smell of burnt oil that had already become part of the suffocating routine of their lives. His trembling hands counted the coins for the 3rd time that afternoon. $57.13, the same amount he had confirmed minutes before, but anxiety forced him to check again, as if the numbers could magically multiply between his calloused fingers. A package of diapers. That's all he needed. All that Claire needed to get through a few more days with dignity. The automatic doors of the supermarket opened with a mechanical sigh, revealing an air-conditioned environment that cruelly contrasted with the hell outside. Michael breathed deeply, inhaling that air conditioning as if it were a temporary luxury, a brief respite before returning to the suffocating reality of his truck. The aisles stretched before him like labyrinths of abundance, shelves filled with products that were once part of his life, when he still had a home, a job, a bank account, that didn't scream red numbers. Now they were just cruel mirages that increased the weight of powerlessness in his chest. Claire woke up slowly, her dark little eyes blinking in confusion at the fluorescent lights. She didn't cry, didn't complain. At 2 years old, she had already learned an unnatural patience, a resignation that cut Michael's heart more deeply than any tear. "We're almost done, my love," he murmured, kissing his daughter's warm forehead. "Soon we'll go back home." Home. The word sounded strange in his mouth. For 3 months, home had been the back seat of a pickup truck parked behind an abandoned tire shop. It was where he told made-up stories to help Claire fall asleep, where he warmed bottles with a cigarette lighter when he was lucky enough to get powdered milk, where he cried silently during cold nights while she slept innocently. The baby product section revealed itself before him like an altar of basic necessities transformed into luxury items. Michael scanned the shelves with trained eyes, comparing prices, calculating possibilities, weighing each penny against Claire's urgent needs. Finally, his hands closed around a simple package of diapers. Unknown brand, packaging without shine but promising to fulfill its basic function. $57. Exactly what he had in his pocket, minus the 13 cents left over for a potential emergency. The path to the checkout seemed endless. Each step highlighted the dull creak of his worn sneakers against the polished floor. Claire played distractedly with the identification badge he still wore from his former company, a piece of plastic that had become her only constant toy. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, scanned the barcode with mechanical efficiency. The beep of the scanner echoed in the air like a final hammer. $58, she announced, without raising her eyes from the screen. The words hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. $58, not $57. He had checked the shelf price 3 times, but the system showed a different reality. 87 cents. The difference seemed insignificant to any normal person, but to him it represented an insurmountable wall. His hands trembled as he placed the coins on the counter, one at a time, as if each movement could magically alter the result. The cashier sighed impatiently, drumming her fingers against the counter as she waited. Behind him, a small line was forming. People with full carts, rushed looks, lives that couldn't pause because of 87 cents missing from a stranger's account. Michael felt the weight of those eyes on his back, some impatient, others pitying, all equally embarrassing. Claire began to squirm restlessly in his arms, uncomfortable with the heat and tension emanating from her father. Her small whimpers of discomfort cut through the tense silence like sharp blades. Michael tried to calm her, whispering sweet words while his mind worked desperately in search of a solution. "Sir, are you paying or not?" The cashier didn't try to disguise the irritation in her voice. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What words could explain the situation without sounding like a plea? How could he ask for understanding over 87 cents without exposing the deep wound of his shattered dignity? It was then that a presence materialized beside him. An elegant woman, dressed in expensive but discreet clothes, hair tied in an impeccable bun that suggested control and sophistication. She didn't speak, didn't make a scene. She simply extended a $50 bill over the counter with the naturalness of someone buying a newspaper. "The difference," she said softly to the cashier. Before turning to the nearby shelves, Michael stood frozen, watching that stranger pick up a package of baby wipes and 2 small jars of fruit puree, adding them to his purchase without asking permission, without explanations. It was as if she instinctively understood not only what he needed, but what Claire would need in the coming days. $82.40, announced the cashier, now with a more respectful tone. The woman paid in silence, put away the change and moved away from the shelves. When she passed by Michael, their eyes met briefly. There was something in those eyes that he couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, more complex. It was as if she recognized something familiar in him, something that awakened a lost memory somewhere distant in her soul. "Thank you," was all Michael could mutter. She nodded slightly and disappeared among the aisles, leaving him alone with Claire and a shopping bag that represented much more than basic necessities. It was materialized hope, restored dignity, a gesture that reminded him that kindness still existed in the world. At the supermarket exit, Michael paused for a moment under the awning, temporarily protected from the merciless sun. Claire had fallen asleep again, peaceful in his arms, as if she sensed that, at least for that day, everything would be okay. He looked around, searching for the mysterious woman, but she had completely disappeared. It was as if she had been just a dream, a mirage of kindness that dissolved in the hot afternoon air. But the bag in his hand was real, and the weight of gratitude in his chest too. As he walked slowly back to the pickup truck, Michael didn't imagine that that casual encounter would forever change the course of his life. He didn't know that the elegant woman would spend the next few days thinking about him and Claire. He couldn't foresee that their destinies were intertwined in a way that transcended that simple moment in the supermarket. The afternoon was beginning to give way to early evening, but for the first time in weeks, Michael didn't just feel the weight of uncertainty. There was something different in the air, a feeling that changes were coming. He didn't know yet what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he had the courage to believe it could be something good. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. Helen Parker adjusted the rearview mirror of her black sedan while watching Michael walk away with Claire in his arms through the supermarket's mirrored glass. There was something in that scene that disturbed her in a strange way, as if a half-forgotten melody insisted on playing in the back of her mind. The way he held the child, the extreme care in each movement, the silent resignation in the face of a situation that could break anyone. The traffic jam on Lakeshore Drive gave her too much time to think. Her hands, always steady during board meetings at Parker Baby, trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Why had she done that? Why had she stepped out of her comfort zone to help a complete stranger? She, who always kept a safe distance from situations that might compromise her public image, had acted on impulse. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The name of Bernard, her executive assistant, flashed on the screen. "Helen, we have the meeting with the Japanese investors in 40 minutes. Are you on your way?" "I'm coming," she replied, trying to recover the professional tone she used as armor. "Prepare the quarterly reports in the conference room. Everything's already ready." "Oh, and your mother called." "She said it's urgent." Helen sighed. Urgent to Vera Parker usually meant some new arranged marriage proposal or criticism about her excessive dedication to work. At 32, Helen had built a solid business empire, but her mother insisted on treating her as if she were a rebellious teenager who needed to be guided to the altar. "Tell her I'll return the call after the meeting," she instructed, hanging up the phone with more force than necessary. The Parker Baby building stood majestic in the heart of Lincoln Park, its 25 floors of glass and steel reflecting the orange sky of late afternoon. Helen parked in the reserved spot in the basement, but sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to organize her thoughts before resuming her routine. The image of Michael and Claire wouldn't leave her head. There was something familiar about that man, something that awakened an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. She was sure she had never seen him before, but something about him echoed distant memories, fragments of a past she preferred to keep buried. The elevator took her to the 23rd floor in silence. The doors opened to reveal the familiar environment of her company. Wide corridors, minimalist decoration in shades of white and grey, the constant hum of controlled activity. Employees greeted her with respectful reverence, but she barely noticed them as she walked toward her office. Bernard waited for her with a stack of documents and her electronic agenda. Tall, thin, always impeccably dressed, he had become her right hand over the past 5 years, managing her professional life with military efficiency. The Japanese want to review the distribution contracts for the Asian market, he informed, following her to the desk. There are some clauses about social responsibility that concern them. Social responsibility? Specifically about our philanthropic projects. They want to ensure there are no risks of association with controversial causes. Helen stopped flipping through the documents. Controversial like what? Well, you know how they are. They want to avoid anything that could be interpreted as political activism or direct involvement with sensitive social issues. She nodded mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere. Roots House, the NGO that her company had financially supported for 3 years, suddenly gained a new dimension in her thoughts. Located on the south side, the organization worked with vulnerable families, offering educational and assistance support for children and adolescents. Helen had never personally visited Roots House. Her contributions were made through automatic bank transfers, an efficient and distant way to fulfill her corporate social responsibility quota. But that afternoon, after the encounter at the supermarket, something had changed in her perspective. The meeting with the investors unfolded without surprises. Numbers were presented, graphs analyzed, contracts discussed with the calculated coldness that characterized the corporate world. Helen participated with her usual competence, but part of her mind remained elsewhere. Wandering through corridors of memories she preferred to keep closed. When the Japanese executives finally left, satisfied with the agreements made, Helen remained alone in her office. The city stretched before the panoramic windows, like an ocean of lights that were beginning to blink in the growing darkness. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she rarely used. Roots House. "Good evening," answered a tired female voice. "This is Helen Parker." "From Parker Baby. I would like to schedule a visit to learn about your work." There was a surprised pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, it would be an honor to receive you." "When would be convenient?" "Tomorrow morning, if possible." No formalities, no press, just a discreet visit to learn about the projects. After settling the details, Helen hung up the phone and contemplated the city below. She had made an impulsive decision, another one on the same day. This wasn't typical of her controlled personality, but something was changing inside her since the encounter with Michael and Claire. That night, in her luxurious apartment in Wicker Park, Helen opened a drawer in her vanity that she rarely touched. At the bottom, wrapped in a silk scarf yellowed by time, was a small cheap metal necklace. The hand-engraved letters on the small plate were worn but still legible, Michael. She had carried that object for more than 25 years, since the night her life changed forever. The fire at Hope Home had consumed not only the building, but also much of her childhood memories. She was only 7 when the flames transformed her world into chaos and terror. The memories of that night came in fragmented flashes. The acrid smell of smoke, the suffocating heat, the deafening noise of structures collapsing. And then, amid the panic, strong arms that lifted her and carried her out of the inferno, an older boy, perhaps 10 or 11, who had gone back into the burning building to save her. She vaguely remembered his face covered in soot, eyes determined despite the fear, the way he protected her with his own body as they ran down the smoke-filled staircase. When they reached the outside, the necklace had fallen from his neck and landed in her lap. At the hospital, when she asked about the other boys from the shelter, they said many had been transferred to different institutions. She never saw him again. For years she fantasized about finding him again. She imagined how it would be to thank him, to discover what kind of man that brave boy had become. But as she grew up and was adopted by the Parker family, the memories of the shelter gradually became more distant, more like dreams than real memories. Now, looking at the necklace in her hands, Helen couldn't shake the strange feeling that had accompanied her since the encounter at the supermarket. Michael, the name on the necklace. Michael Newman. The man she had met that afternoon. It could just be coincidence. Michael was a common name, and her childhood memories were too foggy to trust completely. But there was something in the way he held Claire, something in the expression of his eyes, that awakened deep echoes in her soul. Helen put the necklace away again and prepared for bed, but sleep didn't come easily. For the first time in years, she dreamed of smoke and flames, of protective arms and a childish voice, whispering that everything would be okay. She dreamed of a brave boy who grew up to become a man struggling alone to protect his own daughter. On the other side of the city, Michael parked the pickup truck behind the abandoned tire shop that had become his temporary refuge. Claire slept deeply in the back seat, satisfied by the baby food that the mysterious woman had bought. He watched his daughter for a long time, feeling a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Who was that woman? Why had she helped him? And why, when he looked into her eyes, did he have the strange feeling that it wasn't the first time they had met? The night promised to be cold, but for the first time in weeks, Michael fell asleep without the usual weight of complete uncertainty. There was something different in the air, a silent promise that changes were approaching. He didn't know yet that his life was about to intertwine again with that elegant woman's, in a way that transcended chance and touched the deep roots of their shared past. The morning dawned grey over Chicago, as Helen drove across the city toward the south side. She had traded the executive sedan for a more discreet model, trying to avoid unnecessary attention that her presence might cause in a neighborhood where luxury cars were rare. As she moved away from the downtown area, the urban landscape gradually changed. Mirrored buildings gave way to simpler constructions. Wide avenues transformed into narrow streets, dotted with small businesses and houses squeezed against each other. The GPS guided her through a labyrinth of alleys to a dead-end street, where Roots House occupied a one-story building painted in faded yellow. A simple sign at the entrance announced the hours of operation and activities offered. Academic reinforcement, vocational workshops, psychosocial support, supplementary food. Words that, in her business reports, were just numbers and statistics, but which there took concrete form. Marilyn Sanchez, the NGO coordinator, received her with a mixture of nervousness and expectation. She was a middle-aged black woman, graying hair tied in a practical bun, simple clothes but impeccably clean. Her eyes shone with the intensity of someone who dedicated her life to a cause greater than herself. "Miss Helen, it's an honor to receive you here," she said, extending her hand firmly. "Usually our supporters prefer to keep their distance from direct operations." Helen shook the offered hand, feeling the difference between the softness of her own palms and the roughness of Marilyn's working hands. "I believe it's important to know where we invest our resources." Of course. Come, I'll show you our work." They walked through the narrow corridors of the adapted house. The walls were covered with colorful children's drawings, motivational phrases written by hand, and photographs of community activities. In one of the rooms, a group of teenagers participated in a computer workshop with clearly donated and reassembled computers. In another, children between 8 and 12 did their homework under the supervision of volunteers. "We serve about 150 families in the region," Marilyn explained as they walked. "Most in situations of social vulnerability. Unemployment, underemployment, families headed by single women, some people in homeless situations." Helen nodded, absorbing the information, but part of her attention was focused on looking for familiar faces among the children and adults circulating around the place. She wouldn't admit to herself that she was specifically looking for Michael and Claire, but her eyes scanned every corner searching for the two. It was when they entered the inner courtyard that she saw them. Claire was sitting on the cement floor, playing with a worn rag doll while humming an incomprehensible melody. It was impossible not to recognize her. With her curly hair tied in 2 small pigtails and the simple little dress she had worn at the supermarket. "That child," Helen pointed discreetly. "Does she always come here?" Marilyn followed her gaze and smiled affectionately. "Ah, Claire. Yes, her father leaves her here for a few hours when he gets some temporary work. She's a sweetheart, very polite. Michael is a mechanic, but he's going through difficulties. Good man, hard worker, but life hasn't been easy for them." Helen's heart accelerated when she heard the name. Michael, the same name on the necklace she had kept for so many years. It could be coincidence, but something deep in her intuition suggested it wasn't. "Is he working now?" she asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. Should be back any moment. He went to check on an opportunity at a shop nearby. We hope it works out. He really needs it. As if summoned by the conversation, Michael appeared at the entrance gate. Helen recognized him immediately, but this time she could observe him more carefully. Tall, thin, shoulders curved by the weight of responsibilities that seemed too big for one person to carry. His clothes were clean but mended, and there were fresh grease marks on his hands, indicating he had been working. When he saw Helen, he stopped abruptly. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. For a moment they stared at each other across the courtyard, as if trying to decipher what destiny was trying to tell them through that improbable encounter. Claire, noticing her father's arrival, dropped the doll and ran towards him with open little arms. "Daddy, Daddy!" Michael lifted her into his arms with a smile that completely transformed his tired expression. There was such pure love in that gesture, such absolute dedication, that Helen felt something tighten in her chest. "Sorry for the interruption," he said, addressing Marilyn but keeping his eyes on Helen. "I didn't know you had a visitor." "Michael, this is Helen Parker, from the company that supports us," Marilyn explained. "Miss Helen, this is Michael Newman, whom we were talking about." The surname confirmed Helen's growing suspicions. Michael Newman. The man from the supermarket, the dedicated father, and possibly the brave boy who had saved her from the fire 25 years ago. "We've met before," Helen said softly, extending her hand. "At the supermarket, the day before yesterday." Michael hesitated before shaking her hand, probably remembering the embarrassment of that moment. "Thank you again for what you did. It was important to us." "It was nothing," she replied, but they both knew that wasn't true. Marilyn looked curiously between the two, sensing the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Claire, oblivious to the complexities of adults, stretched her little arms toward Helen with the spontaneity typical of small children. "Pretty lady," she said, smiling. Helen felt her heart melt. She hesitated only a moment before extending her arms and receiving the child. Claire settled naturally in her lap, playing with the buttons on the woman's blazer with innocent fascination. Michael watched the scene with an indescribable expression. There was caution in his eyes, but also a strange familiarity, as if he recognized something in Helen that he couldn't name. "How did it go at the shop?" asked Marilyn. Michael turned his gaze from Helen to answer. "Well, I think. They said they'll call me if they need someone. Just wait." Helen noticed the poorly disguised frustration in his voice. She recognized that tone of someone who was tired of waiting for opportunities that might never come, of depending on the goodwill of others to support his family. "What kind of mechanical work do you do?" she asked, still with Claire in her lap. "Whatever comes up," he answered with raw honesty. "Cars, motorcycles, trucks. I learned by working. I don't have formal certificates, but I know how to do the job." An idea began to form in Helen's mind. Parker Baby maintained a fleet of vans for distribution that constantly needed maintenance. They outsourced the service to an expensive shop that wasn't always efficient. Perhaps there was an opportunity there, a way to help without sounding condescending. "Our company has several vans that always need maintenance," she said carefully. "Perhaps we could talk about that." Michael stiffened. "I don't need charity." The response came quick and defensive, carrying a wounded pride that Helen understood perfectly. She had crossed an invisible line, offered help too directly, too obviously. "It wouldn't be charity," she replied calmly. "It would be work. We pay well, but we demand quality. If you're not competent, you won't last even a week." Something changed in Michael's expression. The distrust was still there, but now mixed with a carefully controlled spark of hope. "I am competent," he said, and there was absolute certainty in his voice. "Then perhaps we should schedule a test," suggested Helen, handing Claire back to her father. "If you're interested." Marilyn watched the exchange with growing excitement, realizing that something important was happening there. Claire protested slightly at having to leave Helen's lap, stretching her little arms toward her again. "Lady stay?" she asked with the sweet and imperfect pronunciation of small children. "I need to go now, sweetie," Helen replied, gently touching the girl's face. "But perhaps we'll see each other soon." She took a business card from her pocket and handed it to Michael. "My assistant can schedule the test whenever you want." Michael took the card as if it were something precious and fragile, studying the printed information. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, looking directly into her eyes. It was a simple question, but one that carried layers of meaning. Why would she, a millionaire executive, offer a job to an unemployed mechanic she had met by chance? Why had she returned to the supermarket looking for him? Why had she personally visited the NGO after years of just financial support? Helen didn't have a simple answer, because she herself didn't fully understand her motivations. There was the humanitarian impulse, of course, but there was something more, a feeling of recognition, an inexplicable familiarity, as if their paths were destined to cross. Because sometimes, she finally said, the universe gives us second chances. The answer sounded too mysterious, but Michael nodded as if he understood. Perhaps he really did. Perhaps he also felt that strange connection, that feeling that they had met before somewhere lost in time. Helen said goodbye to Marilyn and left Ruth's house with more questions than answers. During the trip back to the city centre, she couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. There was something about Michael that awakened old memories, fragments of a past she had tried to bury for so many years. That night, alone in her apartment, she opened the drawer where she kept the necklace again. The worn letters seemed to pulse with new energy. Michael. Was she clinging to coincidences, creating connections where they didn't exist? Or was it possible that the brave boy from her past had become the proud and dedicated man she had met at Ruth's house? If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. Michael arrived at the Parker Baby headquarters an hour before the scheduled time. He parked the pickup truck on a side street, away from the luxury cars that occupied the building's parking lot, and watched the movement through the fogged window. Well-dressed executives came and went with hurried steps, carrying leather briefcases and talking on expensive phones. It was a completely different world from his, and for a moment he wondered if he wasn't making a mistake. Claire slept in the passenger seat, wrapped in a small blanket that Marilyn had given as a gift. He contemplated her for a few minutes, remembering all the nights he had promised himself he would find a way to give her a better life. Perhaps this was his chance. At 9 o'clock sharp, he presented himself at the reception. The young woman behind the counter, impeccably made up and dressed, looked at him with disguised curiosity before making an internal call. "Mr. Bernard? The mechanic for the van test is here." "Yes, sir." A few minutes later, a tall, elegant man came down by elevator. Bernard greeted Michael with cordial professionalism, but his eyes quickly assessed the simple clothes and calloused hands of the visitor. "Mr. Michael, I'm Bernard, Miss Helen's executive assistant. She mentioned that you have experience with automotive maintenance." 15 years working with engines," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice firm. "I started as a helper at 16. "Excellent. Let's go to the garage so you can see our fleet." The basement of the building housed an impeccably organized garage. 12 white vans with the Parker Baby logo were aligned in numbered spaces. Bernard led Michael to a van with an open hood, where a uniformed mechanic was working on the engine. "This is our headache at the moment," Bernard explained. "Intermittent problem in the electrical system. Sometimes it starts, sometimes it doesn't. Our outsourced shop has tried to fix it 3 times, but the problem persists." Michael approached and observed the engine with experienced eyes. He asked for permission to touch and began to methodically examine the components. His hands moved with precision and confidence, touching wires, checking connections, testing components with the assurance of someone who intimately knew that type of work. "May I start the engine?" he asked. Bernard nodded. Michael turned the key and listened attentively to the engine's noises, like a doctor listening to a patient's heartbeats. He turned it off, moved some connections, and tried again. The engine started smoothly. "The problem is in the wiring harness," he diagnosed. "There's a stripped wire here that sometimes makes contact, sometimes doesn't. It's definitely an intermittent fault. 15 minutes of work will fix it." The mechanic from the contracted shop, who was watching the scene with skepticism, crossed his arms. "That's already been checked." Michael didn't respond with words. He simply took a screwdriver and in a few precise movements isolated the problematic wire with electrical tape. He started the engine again. It worked perfectly. He turned it off and on 3 more times. Not a strange noise. "Problem solved," he simply said. Bernard exchanged a significant look with the shop mechanic, who left muttering something about beginner's luck. but Michael had just proven his competence in 5 minutes. Impressive, Bernard admitted. Ms. Helen mentioned that you're going through difficulties. Do you have any objection to bringing your daughter to work occasionally? I know your situation is special. The question caught Michael by surprise. Had Helen told Bernard about Claire, about his precarious housing situation? He felt his face heat up, divided between gratitude and embarrassment. Claire is well behaved, he said defensively. She wouldn't bother anyone. I'm sure she wouldn't. In fact, Ms. Helen suggested we set up a small children's area here in the garage, if you accept working with us. Nothing elaborate, just a safe corner where she can play while you work. Michael was speechless. Since when did millionaire executives worry about the well-being of unemployed mechanics' daughters? There was something in that situation that didn't make complete sense, but he was too tired to question a miracle when it presented itself. What would be the salary? He asked, trying to keep practicality above emotion. Bernard mentioned an amount that made Michael blink several times to make sure he had heard correctly. It was almost double what he earned at his last permanent job, plus benefits that included health insurance and meal vouchers. It's a fair value for the work we expect, Bernard explained, noting Michael's surprise. We maintain high standards, but we reward adequately. When can I start? Tomorrow, if you want. Business hours, Monday to Friday. Occasionally some Saturday, but with extra pay. Michael nodded, still processing the sudden change his life was taking. I need to get Claire. She's in the truck. Of course. And Michael? Bernard called him when he was already heading to the elevator. Ms. Helen asked me to make it clear. This is work, not charity. We expect excellence and commitment. If you don't meet expectations, you will be dismissed like any other employee. Understood, Michael replied, and for the first time in months there was true relief in his voice. That afternoon, Helen received Bernard's report about Michael's test. She was in her office when he knocked on the door, carrying a folder with documents. How did it go? She asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. Impressive, Bernard admitted. He solved in 5 minutes a problem our outsourced shop couldn't diagnose for weeks, and he did it without special tools, just with practical knowledge. Helen smiled, satisfied, but tried not to show how much that news pleased her. And about his daughter's situation. He accepted all conditions without questions. He seemed surprised by our flexibility, but grateful. Great. Prepare the hiring documents and set up the space we discussed in the garage. After Bernard left, Helen was alone with her thoughts. There was something deeply gratifying in knowing that Michael would now have a real opportunity to rebuild his life. But there was also a growing anxiety, a feeling that she was getting more involved than she should, in a situation that could become complicated. That night, Michael parked the pickup truck for the last time behind the abandoned tire shop. Starting the next day with his first salary, he could pay for a simple studio apartment. It wouldn't be luxurious, but it would be a real home for Claire, with hot water, a working refrigerator and a clean bathroom. Claire played with the ragdoll she had received at Ruth's house, talking to herself in a language that mixed real words with invented sounds. Michael watched her with a love that hurt in his chest. In a few days, his life had completely changed, from a casual encounter at a supermarket to a job at one of the country's largest baby product companies. "Daddy works tomorrow?" asked Claire, using her favorite phrase for any new situation. "Yes, my love. Daddy's going to work and you'll be close by playing." "With the pretty lady?" Michael smiled. Claire had been enchanted with Helen since their first meeting. There was something in the way the executive had held his daughter, a naturalness and affection that seemed genuine, not forced. "Maybe the pretty lady will show up sometimes," he said. Actually, Michael secretly hoped Helen would appear. There was something about her that intrigued him, an inexplicable familiarity that awakened old and confused memories. Sometimes when she looked at him, he had the feeling that she also felt that strange connection, as if they knew each other from some place lost in time. As Claire fell asleep in his arms, Michael made silent promises. He would work hard, prove his worth, rebuild his life brick by brick, and maybe, just maybe, discover why destiny had placed Helen Parker in his path exactly when he most needed a second chance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Helen opened the drawer where she kept the necklace with Michael's name again. The worn letters seemed to shine in the soft light of the lamp. Tomorrow, Michael would start working at her company. They would be closer, would have more opportunities to talk, to get to know each other better. And perhaps finally, she would have the courage to discover if her suspicions were correct. If the man she had just hired was really the brave boy who had saved her from the flames so many years ago. If destiny was giving them a second chance to meet again and, this time, not lose each other again. 3 weeks after Michael began working at Parker Baby, a comfortable routine had been established. He arrived early at the garage. Claire settled into the special corner that Helen had ordered, prepared with educational toys and a small, colorful table. And the day passed with the tranquility of a finally organized life. Michael had proven to be not just competent, but exceptional at work. He diagnosed problems that other technicians couldn't identify and implemented creative solutions that saved time and money for the company. Helen had begun to make discreet visits to the garage, always with the excuse of checking on the progress of services, but actually observing the interaction between father and daughter with growing curiosity. Claire always received her with childish joy, running into her arms with the spontaneity of someone who knows no social prejudices. Michael, in turn, maintained a respectful cordiality, but Helen perceived that he also felt that strange familiarity that connected them. It was on a Thursday morning that everything changed. Helen had gone down to the garage to talk with Michael about expanding the maintenance program when a volunteer from Roots House unexpectedly appeared. Carl, a young college student who documented the NGO's activities for social media, had stopped by the company to deliver some reports when he learned that Michael worked there. "Michael, what a coincidence!" he shouted, instinctively pulling out his cell phone. "Can I record a moment? To show how you're adapting to the new job." Before anyone could protest, Carl had already taken several photos. One of them captured exactly the moment when Helen, kneeling beside the pickup truck where Michael was working, held Claire in her lap while explaining something about the engine to the child. It was an intimate, natural scene of an almost familiar beauty that conveyed genuine affection and care. "Perfect," exclaimed Carl, already editing the images on his own cell phone. "I'll post it on the Roots House profile with a caption about overcoming and solidarity." Helen and Michael exchanged a worried look, but Carl had already disappeared, probably going up to deliver the reports to Bernard. They didn't imagine that in a few hours, that innocent image would spread across the internet like wildfire. The first notification reached Helen's cell phone during a meeting with international investors. It was a message from her press officer. "Need to see this urgently. You're viral on social media." Helen excused herself from the meeting and locked herself in the executive bathroom to check what was happening. What she saw made her sick. The photo had been shared thousands of times in a few hours, but with captions completely distorted from reality. "Millionaire adopts poor for a day to improve public image," said one of the most shared headlines. "Parker Baby CEO in humanized marketing campaign," announced another. The comments were even worse, ranging from fierce criticism about social theater of the rich to superficial praise about example of citizen entrepreneur. What hurt most were the direct attacks on Michael and Claire. People who didn't know them made cruel speculations about their lives, their motivations, their dignity. They called Michael an opportunist and Claire a puppet in a publicity staging. The privacy he valued so much had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Helen tried to call Michael, but he didn't answer. She ran down to the garage and found him putting his tools in an old metal box, while Claire cried in her corner, scared by her father's tension. "Michael, wait. We can talk about this." He turned to her with an expression that mixed pain and revolt. "Did you know this would happen?" "Of course not. I would never allow you to be exposed like this. But it happened, and now Claire and I are memes on the internet. People who have never seen us are joking about our life, our situation." Helen approached, trying to touch his arm, but he moved away. "We can sue those who spread lies. My legal team can handle this. With more publicity, more exposure?" Michael shook his head. "No, thank you. We've had enough exposure." "Then what are you going to do? Leave because of some idiotic comments on the internet?" The question came out more aggressive than Helen intended, but she was frustrated, desperate for him not to leave at the exact moment their lives were beginning to intertwine again. Michael stopped putting away the tools and faced her. "Some idiotic comments. Helen, they're questioning whether you hired me for competence or pity. They're suggesting that Claire is an accessory in your image campaign. These aren't just comments. This is our dignity being trampled in public." His words hit Helen like slaps in the face. She had thought only of her own corporate reputation, the impacts on her business, but hadn't fully considered how that exposure would emotionally affect Michael and Claire. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "You're right. I should have thought better about how to protect you from this." Michael sighed, picking Claire up. The little girl had stopped crying, but her eyes were red and confused. "It's not your fault, but I need to protect my daughter. She didn't ask to be part of a media circus. What if I can control the situation? My communication team can reverse this narrative, show the truth." "What truth, Helen?" His question carried layers of meaning that she wasn't prepared to explore. "That you helped me out of kindness? That you hired me for competence? Or is there something more that neither of us is admitting?" The silence that followed was loaded with unresolved tension. There was something between the lines of that conversation, questions that neither of them had the courage to ask directly. Why did she care so much about him and Claire? Why did she feel that inexplicable connection? Why did he awaken memories that she preferred to keep buried? "Stay one more week," she finally asked. "Let me try to fix this situation. If I can't, you can leave with an exemplary recommendation letter and a severance package that will help you get established somewhere else." Michael studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read her true intentions. Claire, still in his arms, stretched a little hand toward Helen, unconsciously trying to reconnect the two adults she loved most. "1 week," he finally agreed. "But if the situation gets worse, if Claire is exposed to more embarrassment, we're leaving. No matter where to." Helen nodded, relieved to have gained more time, but knowing that the week ahead would be crucial. She couldn't just control the narrative on social media. She needed to understand why she cared so much about this man and his daughter. She needed to discover if her suspicions about their past were correct. And most importantly, she needed to decide what she would do with these discoveries. That night, Michael parked the pickup truck in a different, more isolated location, fearing that someone might recognize them on the street. Claire slept restlessly, talking in her sleep about pretty lady and people fighting. He stayed awake until late, scrolling through social media and reading comments that ranged from cruel to pitying, but were all equally invasive. Why did Helen care so much? Why had she insisted he stay? There was something in the way she looked at him, in the way she held Claire, that awakened fragmented memories from his childhood, memories of a small girl he had saved from a fire many years ago. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The world wasn't that small. Meanwhile, Helen reviewed the old Roots House files she had obtained from Marilyn. Among yellow documents and handwritten lists, she found what she was looking for: records of survivors of the fire at Hope Home in 1999. 2 names highlighted on a transfer list: Helen Jones, 7 years old, and Michael Newman, 10 years old. She held the necklace with the engraved name, the pieces finally fitting into a truth she had suspected, but dared not confirm. Michael really was the boy who had saved her. Fate had not only brought them together casually, it was giving them a second chance not to lose each other again. But now she knew the truth. The question was, what would she do with it? The week passed like an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Helen worked tirelessly with her communication team to control the damage in the press. She gave carefully prepared interviews, explaining her corporate social responsibility program and highlighting Michael's professional competence. Gradually, the narrative began to change on social media, with people getting to know the real story better and recognizing the value of the work he was doing in the company. Michael maintained his routine, but with renewed caution. He avoided areas where he could be photographed and limited his interactions with Helen to the strictly professional. Claire, with the natural adaptability of small children, soon forgot the disturbing episode and returned to playing happily in her special corner of the garage. It was on Thursday of that decisive week that Helen made a decision that would change everything. She had spent sleepless nights thinking about the necklace kept in her vanity, the shelter documents, the fragmented memories of a night of fire that had defined the course of her life. She could no longer live with suspicions. She needed to know the truth. She went down to the garage at the end of the afternoon when most of the employees had already left. Michael was doing final maintenance on a van, while Claire was drawing on a sheet of paper, her tongue out in absolute concentration. "Michael," Helen called softly. "Can we talk?" He raised his eyes from the engine, noticing something different in her voice. There was a seriousness there, a tension that went beyond the professional problems of the last few days. "Sure," he replied, cleaning his hands on a cloth. "Claire, stay there drawing, okay, my love?" Helen led him to a more private corner of the garage, away from the reach of security cameras. For a moment they stood in silence, as if both knew that the conversation that would follow would change everything between them. "I need to ask you something," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly. "About your past, about when you were a child." Michael stiffened. He rarely talked about his childhood in shelters, about the difficult years before he managed to emancipate himself and try to build his own life. "What do you want to know?" Helen took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back after this moment. "Do you remember Hope Home, the fire in 1999? Michael's reaction was instantaneous. His face paled and he took a step back, as if he had been punched in the stomach. "How do you know about that?" "Because I was there," said Helen, her voice barely a whisper. "I was 7 years old. You were 10. And you saved me." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at her with wide eyes, as if seeing a ghost. Slowly, the pieces began to fit in his mind. The inexplicable familiarity, the feeling of having seen her before, the strange connection he had felt since their first meeting. "Helen Jones," he murmured, remembering the full name of the little girl he had carried out of the burning building. "You were the little girl from the 3rd floor, always shy, who cried softly when she thought no one was watching." Tears began to stream down Helen's face. "You remember? How could I forget? It was the scariest night of my life, but also the one that made me feel I could do something important. Protect someone who needed it." Helen opened her purse with trembling hands and took out the small metal necklace. "This fell from your neck when you carried me out. I've kept it all these years, hoping one day to find you and thank you." Michael looked at the object as if it were a sacred relic. His own eyes filled with tears as he took the necklace and read his own name engraved with the childish calligraphy of decades past. "I looked for you afterward," he said with a choked voice. "When they transferred me to another shelter, I tried to find out where you had gone, but I never could find you. I was adopted 2 weeks after the fire," Helen explained. "The Parker family took me to a completely different life. I had opportunities, education, everything a child could want. But I always carried the memory of the brave boy who risked his own life to save me." They stared at each other for a long moment, 25 years of separation, dissolving into a mutual understanding that transcended words. It was as if 2 pieces of a puzzle finally fit in the right place. "That's why you helped me at the supermarket," said Michael, finally understanding. "You recognized me, not consciously, but there was something about you. The way you held Claire that awakened old memories. It was only when I learned your full name that I began to suspect." Michael shook his head, still processing the magnitude of the revelation. "And I thought it was coincidence. That fate was being kind to me by chance." "Maybe it's not chance," Helen suggested softly. "Maybe it's the universe giving us a second chance. An opportunity not to lose each other again." At that moment, Claire appeared running, her drawing in her hands. "Daddy! Miss Helen! Look what I made!" She proudly showed a colorful figure depicting 3 people holding hands. A tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small girl. Underneath, in crooked letters, she had written, "My family." Michael and Helen looked at each other, both deeply touched by the innocence of the child who, without knowing the complex history that united them, had instinctively captured the connection between them. "It's beautiful, my love," said Michael, kneeling to be at his daughter's height. "Can Miss Helen have dinner with us today?" asked Claire with the spontaneity typical of children. "At our new home?" Helen looked at Michael, a silent question in her eyes. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I think we can arrange that," he said. 2 hours later, the 3 were in the small studio apartment that Michael had managed to rent with his first salary. It was a simple space, but clean and organized, with some of Claire's toys scattered on the floor and the welcoming smell of home-cooked food in the air. Helen had insisted on bringing dinner from a nearby restaurant, But Michael prepared a simple salad with fresh ingredients he had bought on the way. It was strange how the situation seemed natural, as if it wasn't the first time they had dinner together as a family. Claire monopolized the conversation, telling stories about her toys and asking questions about everything she saw in Helen's house through her childish imagination. The two adults took turns answering, exchanging meaningful looks over the girl's head. When Claire finally fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by the excitement of the special day, Michael carried her to the small room they had improvised for her. Helen waited in the living room, observing the simple photographs he had placed on a shelf. Claire as a baby, Claire taking her first steps, Claire smiling with an ice cream. "She's your whole life," Helen observed when Michael returned. "She's the most precious thing I have in the world," he confirmed. "When we were left alone, I thought I wouldn't make it. But Claire gives me strength to continue every day." Helen nodded, deeply understanding that unconditional love. "You're an amazing father, Michael. Claire is very lucky, and I'm lucky to have found you again," he said, sitting next to her on the small sofa. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't appeared at the supermarket that day." "Maybe it was inevitable," Helen suggested. "Maybe we were destined to meet again." Michael took her hand, intertwining his fingers with gentleness. "What happens now? With this whole story, with what we discovered?" Helen looked at him, seeing not the employee she had hired on impulse, but the brave boy who had saved her so many years ago, grown to become a man of integrity and dedication. "Now," she said, "we rebuild. Together this time, you, me, and Claire, like a real family." Michael smiled, a smile that lit up his whole tired face. For the first time in years, he was certain that the future would be better than the past. 6 months later, Michael had been promoted to maintenance supervisor for the Parker baby fleet. His competence and dedication impressed not only Helen but the entire company board. He and Claire moved to a larger apartment, still simple but comfortable, where Helen was a frequent visitor. Roots House gained a new project, a vocational automotive mechanics workshop, fully financed by Parker Baby and coordinated by Michael on weekends. The program offered real training opportunities for young people in vulnerable situations, creating a virtuous cycle of social transformation. The controversy on social media had transformed into an inspiring story of overcoming and reunion. Several media outlets sought Helen and Michael for interviews, but they chose to maintain privacy, sharing just enough to show that second chances exist for those who have the courage to accept help and work for real change. Claire, now almost 3 years old, divided her time between the apartment with her father and visits to Helen's house, who had officially become her godmother. The girl grew surrounded by love and opportunities, but without ever forgetting where she came from, learning values of gratitude and solidarity that would accompany her throughout her life. And Helen, for the first time since childhood, felt that she had found not only her professional purpose, but her true family. Business success remained important, but now had a deeper meaning. It was a tool to create opportunities and transform lives, beginning with her own. The necklace with Michael's name now stayed in a frame